Blog Talk Radio.
Are you ready to take a bite out of the competition? Are you looking for ideas to make your business better? Welcome to the Core Business Show with Tim Joncas,
sponsored by Apple Capital Group.
At the core of every successful business, you'll find people making a difference. And with each episode of the Core Business Show, we talk with those people, examine those ideas, and explore the strategies that make them special. Now, the host of the Core Business Show, Tim Joncas.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Core Business Show. I'm Tim Joncas, your host. Today, I have the pleasure of having Father Jan Michael Joncas. He is on the show today. He's going to talk about his career, his music, his education, and his musical styles. If you'd like to join the conversation, please call in at 347-324-3460, or you can go ahead and pose a question in the chat room, or you can go ahead and email us at info@thecorebusinessshow. Well, Father, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
I guess to begin with, kind of tell us about, the listeners love personal stories from composers and artists. Kind of tell us about what is your story? How did you actually get into, at the very beginning, into music?
Oh, well, that's actually fairly easy. My mother was trained as a lyric soprano who pretty much gave up her career to raise the 8 of us children, but she continued to sing at home, and so she'd hand on that kind of training to us. And my dad was in technical theater, so that gave us the opportunity, for example, to go to the Metropolitan Opera whenever it happened to be in town, and he was working as a stagehand. So those two influences were pretty strong growing up. Then secondly, I went off to seminary education in 9th grade.
Wow.
So, yep, way back when. So that was a chance to really get to learn the chant tradition of the Roman Catholic heritage and polyphony. And then finally, because I was growing up in the 60s, this was a chance to learn a lot of the folk music tradition. So I think all three of those really came together: classical music, the chant heritage, and some of the more popular music that was happening.
Now, you grew up in the Midwest?
Yes, I'm a native of Minneapolis and have pretty much lived my whole life in the Twin Cities.
Wow. And you're part of a particular order, or?
Nope, I'm just a diocesan priest for St. Paul, Minneapolis Archdiocese.
Wow. Now, when you mentioned something unique. During that particular time, you say that you went to the seminary in the 9th grade. Things were much different during that time. Can you explain how different?
Sure. When I was growing up, which was just prior to our Second Vatican Council, all of our worship in the Roman Rite was done in the Latin language, and our music was done all in chant. So, for example, I learned how to sing the funeral mass, what was called the Requiem Mass in those days, all in Latin, as a second grader, and would sing that,
Wow.
being brought over to funerals early in the morning before we started class as grade schoolers. But while I was in high school, the Second Vatican Council was taking place, and it, as one of its prescriptions, opened up the possibility of church music in the Roman Rite to vernacular singing, in this case English. So that opened up a great opportunity for new compositions for church use that would be using the English language.
Well, do you think we're missing something, part of that process back in those particular days and what we have today?
Well, we're always in a process of transformation. So I think right now there is a movement among various church musicians to attempt to restore some of the glory of chant and some of the glory of multiple voiced singing, what we call polyphony. The question, of course, is always to see how that can be brought into intelligible worship, because the council also called for what they said was full, conscious, and active participation of the faithful. So the hope was always that they would not only just sing these pieces as kind of museum pieces, but that they'd understand what they were singing and see how it connected to their worship and to the rest of their lives.
Wow. People are always talking about liturgical music and chant as a whole. kind of tell us, in a church view, for people, what is considered liturgical music and suitable music for the liturgy?
As you might guess, that's a very disputed question. But
I know.
But I can actually answer part of it without a lot of controversy. The term liturgical music, as opposed to, say, church music or spiritual music, liturgical music means very specifically music intended for public worship, according to the official services of a particular church. So since I'm Roman Catholic, when I speak of liturgical music for the Roman Catholic Church, and specifically in the Roman Rite, I'm getting real technical with you here.
No, that's fine.
I would mean music that would be associated with the celebration of the sacraments, the sacramentals, and the liturgy of the hours. So music for Mass, baptism, confirmation, anointing of the sick, that kind of stuff. Celebrations of things like benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, and then finally the daily office, or the prayers that say monks and nuns or priests and deacons would pray: morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer, what we used to call lauds and vespers. That's settings of psalms and canticles that we'd have as part of our daily prayer. And all of that would be liturgical music.
Wow. How have we evolved from that particular time in the 60s to where we are today? I remember when I first picked up the book, Glory and Praise, in probably 1979, in middle school, and the old congregants.
Oh, you're very young.
And the fellow musicians down the street and around the town said, "Oh, this is music," and it's up to from 80 to really it started dying down to about 2000. They considered the Glory and Praise stuff was stuff from the devil. Just recently it has died down. From the ones who were there from the change and part of the old church.
Yeah.
Tell us about this evolution of music, because we have went through a huge evolution of music within the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Actually, a very short time for that amount of change in our musical worship. And it's cost a lot. I have to be honest. There are some people who found that transition very difficult. So I think part of the reason why there is this desire to restore some chant and polyphony is precisely to make sure that we don't lose part of the heritage. But I think it's easy to see that in the first years, maybe the first 10 to 15 years after the council, so in the late 60s through the early 80s, there were all sorts of experiments going on, including that collection that you were talking about, Glory and Praise. And that music tended to be very simple, very singable, but patterned on maybe folk music, almost hootenanny singing, where it would be almost immediately accessible, easy for people to sing. But just as that folk music went out of style, I mean, people stopped listening to Joan Baez and Peter, Paul, and Mary, except for, devoted listeners. So, too, that tended to go out of style within church music after a while. Anyway, the next wave became a little more sophisticated, and you had people who had worked with that style becoming more sophisticated in terms of the text that they wrote and also the orchestration. It was no longer just a couple of guitars playing, but maybe guitars and a bass and a piano and some woodwinds, and it was just much, much more sophisticated in the next 15 years or so. And then you got a new wave of world music, where that style became increasingly connected to music from different parts of the world. So it might have an English text, but you could hear Spanish influences or influences from, say, South Africa, and all of that became became part of what church music could be too. Now, I'm not saying that swept every parish. Admittedly, some parishes, frankly, maintained only a chant or polyphony heritage, but other parishes were very open to all sorts of new influences, and we're still figuring that out.
Wow. What do you see as the church itself today? We have grown pretty much in the last 20 years from some parishes, maybe 300 to 700 families. We've now at cities of 10,000, and I think the average now is coming to be around 2,000 or 3,000 families, which go back 30 years ago, that those were mega churches or huge churches at the time. Now we're reaching 10,000. What is going on with the church that we're just generating so many people coming to the Catholic Church just within this last 15-year period?
Again, that's a really interesting question. You'd almost have to talk to someone who's a sociologist of religion to get a real accurate thing on that, or a demographer, and I'm neither. But I suspect that's an issue for urban Catholicism rather than rural areas. So, for example, here in the Twin Cities, we see that kind of clustering of parishes happening in our urban area, and thus, say, some suburban parishes becoming almost mega churches, 2,000, 2,500 families. But the rural places still retaining, 150 to 200 families per parish. The real issue, if I'm reading this correctly, is our ordained leadership, as there are fewer and fewer priests per parishioners, and that proportion keeps shifting over time. Since there are fewer and fewer priests per people, there will be more and more people within a parish guided by a particular priest. That really seems to be where the demographics is going. The second issue is, as there are waves of immigration happening in the United States, many Spanish-speaking folk and now folk from various Asian groups are really entering Roman Catholic heritage, or maintaining that, like Spanish-speaking have had strong Roman Catholic heritage for centuries, but are entering into church life in the United States in a new way as immigrant groups are coming in, and that's swelling our numbers as well. So, I think those two factors would be something that's doing that.
Well, let's move back into education. So you're in academia, and and we thank you for that comment. I think it really helps trying to get a perspective on that. In education itself, the church is real prolific when it comes to education of its people and its clergy. What advice do you have for people, upcoming musicians and upcoming liturgists, to seek out education and why they should seek it out? I mean, it's not covered by financial aid, and that's one thing about it. But the church usually provides to get you there regardless. You just have to ask. But kind of talk about your education as a liturgist and a scholar, what you've been through, and how it impacted really your career and your life.
Oh, okay. Right. Oh, well, I'm going to pass over grade school and high school. Jump to college. I went to the then College of St. Thomas here in St. Paul and graduated with a BA in English because I really wanted a degree in humanities, but we didn't have one then, and English was the closest I could get to it. Then after that, I actually dropped out of the seminary system for a while and worked. And while I was doing that work, I put myself through a master's program in liturgical studies at the University of Notre Dame. That took about 3 or 4 summers to do, as I recall. And then having that MA, I also then went back to the seminary system because I, by that stage, felt that it was clearer that I had been called to be a priest. So I picked up another master's degree as part of my seminary education in systematic theology. And then, once I got ordained and had worked in a parish for some years and also at a Newman Center, which is a Catholic center on a secular campus, university campus, my bishop asked what I would like to do next, and I said I'd like to finish off my education with a doctorate if possible. So he's agreed with that and sent me off to Rome for 4 years to study at Sant'Anselmo, which is probably the world center for liturgical studies under Roman Catholic auspices. So I've been really lucky. I've had a lot of education. But what you hear in that is not a lot of training in music. That was separate. So the advice I normally give to people about this is if you're a musician, get as much music training as you can, both academic and practical. If you're a liturgist, get training in 3 areas. You have to know the history of worship, you have to know the theology of worship, and then you have to know the very practical stuff, usually that you get from social science, about how to work with people, how to work with symbol systems, how to understand people's reaction to changes in worship, because your task is to really help them to appropriate all of this stuff in prayer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I really appreciate the advice.
Yeah.
And talking to your career regarding nearly 16 or over 16 albums altogether, kind of tell us about that journey with your musical career from your first piece that you wrote and you got published to something more so recent.
Oh, okay. It's actually kind of funny. I did my first album way back when I was 18, and frankly recorded it when I was still in high school. And it was part of that first wave we talked about. Fortunately, there are no copies of it available for sale anymore. And the company that published it originally had a little financial hiccup, so it never got distributed very widely. Because now, listening to it, it kind of sounds like the mamas and the papas go to church. It's just not very good. But what that meant was that for the next 10 years, I didn't publish anything. I wrote a lot and basically kept all these manuscripts in an archive that the Sisters of St. Francis down in Rochester, Minnesota kept. And people could get the manuscripts for the price of Xeroxing them. And after 10 years, that had really built up. So the sisters said, we think you should start publishing again. So I fortunately got connected with a company that was out in Phoenix at that stage, and they took 12 of those pieces, and we recorded them, and I've bounced among 3 liturgical music publishers ever since. I never wanted to be owned by any one publisher. So I like working with 3 different groups, even though I think that's sometimes hard for the people that want to buy this stuff because they never know, which publisher a particular collection comes from. So I've just been working ever since, from my late 20s until now.
Well, tell us about your musical style. How do you define your music, and how your music comes to you? Does it come in the middle of the night, or it all of a sudden it's a tune in your head and you just work it out, or it's just everything just flows?
Yeah. Well, let me say the style one first, and then I'll talk about the other. The problem for me is that I have no style. I'm utterly eclectic. I think people, I will write from a single line of melody with a simple guitar accompaniment all the way up to, a double choir SATB plus full orchestral accompaniment. It really depends on what I'm trying to communicate, what the text is, what the occasion is that the piece is for. So I really write in a lot of different styles. I would call them American lyric. And as I've said before, I tend to be influenced by the folk revival, but I'm also influenced by a lot of 20th century classical music. So people like Benjamin Britten were very important to me, or Ray Vaughan Williams, some of those classical composers. So style, all over the map. Then in terms of the actual composition process, I almost always start with the text. So whether it's a text directly taken from the liturgy or a poem, and then I just kind of live with that text for a while. I try to imagine how that text would be used in a particular context for worship. So, for example, a Lamb of God text would be used in the Eucharistic liturgy during the breaking of the bread. So I try to write a musical setting that will help that text accompany that particular ritual action. And the actual melody then kind of arises mysteriously. You're saying in the night, and that's accurate. I frequently write between about 11 o'clock at night and 2 in the morning.
Wow.
That's after my work day as a teacher and a priest. So, there's not a lot of phone calls then, and it's pretty quiet. So I get a chance to work then. But honestly, the inspiration part of it is maybe 5%. And the rest of it is just the hard work of working it through, thinking through the various permutations that you can take a melodic material or a harmonic progression into. And that's the work of composition.
Wow. What artists do you normally look towards, or you like to not necessarily model because you have your own style, but back in time, as you're growing up or even today, who do you actually listen to as musicians or artists?
Oh, yeah. That's very tough to say because I listen to all sorts of stuff all the time. Are you thinking classical or are you thinking pop?
Classical, pop.
Wow. Okay.
Country?
Well, classical, the whole Baroque period with Bach and Handel being probably the biggest influences. The classical period with Mozart and Haydn are also really important to me for orchestration. Interestingly enough, the Romantics, from Beethoven on, I loved them as a kid, but I haven't found them all that influential now. But the 20th century folks from Stravinsky on, probably my greatest influence was Bartók. I love Bartók. I'm overwhelmed by his genius. And then listening to some contemporaries like Adams and a few of the minimalists, Goretzky and a few of those. So that's the classical side. Oh, I listen to a lot of musical theater, and there, Stephen Sondheim just overwhelms me. His ability to take fairly sophisticated musical schemes and then connect them to really sophisticated language and further a plot by doing it. I'm just in awe of Sondheim. And then pop music, it's all over the map. Probably the folks I find most interesting are folks like Joni Mitchell or Paul Simon or Sting. These long-term writers whose styles have changed over time, who seem, again, lyrically really sophisticated, but also musically they just keep exploring. I mean, for Joni Mitchell to do an album with Charles Mingus just blows me away. Amazing artist. So those are the folks that I'm interested in.
Okay. When you actually sit down and pen your titles like On Eagle's Wings and I Have Loved You, what went through your mind when those tunes were birthed?
Oh, well, actually, it's easier to talk about the situations in which they were raised.
Wow.
I Have Loved You was written for the Sisters of St. Francis down in Rochester for a gathering where all the sisters come back for what they call a chapter of Mass, which is like a giant convention. And one year I knew that was happening. I wanted to say thank you to them for their generosity to me. And originally I wrote it all for women's voices. So, they'd have this kind of lovely 3-part vocal harmony, and they still sing it. So that's what the idea was behind that one. I Have Loved You On Eagle's Wings was written when I was visiting a friend of mine in Washington, D.C., and we went out for dinner. When we came back, there was a message saying that his dad had a heart attack. And so we spent the evening talking. He went back to Omaha the next day, and I wrote the song between that day and the wake service for his dad. And it was first sung in Omaha for that wake service. So sometimes sometimes it's like a very corporate thing, like with the Sisters of St. Francis. Sometimes it's very personal. Yeah.
When it came to On Eagle's Wings, the introduction to verse 1, from the verse to the chorus, how do you think of how you pull all of those three elements together?
Well, of course, that's a big problem because I'll be technical for a second. I'm starting on a suspension of a subdominant, which is really weird. And the idea there was that the verses of that song would be sung by a cantor. And so I could write a much more sophisticated melodic line, assuming that the cantor would be a trained musician and all of that. And then the refrain is much more straightforward. It's a series of suspensions that are all very logical. Now, on the other hand, the range of the refrain is really wide. It's like an octave and a quarter. It's as big as the Star Spangled Banner. So, but the idea was that the people would only sing the refrain, and the cantor would do all the sophisticated singing of the verses. Well, lo and behold, people ended up liking the song, so they end up singing the verses too. And I think it's always a little tough for them to get it started because it really does just start in a odd suspended place. But I liked that because that seemed to me to illustrate the text pretty well. It brings you into the text in a kind of almost ambiguous way, and then you get the chorus coming in much more straightforwardly. It's almost like the verses are probing what the divine is, and then the refrain comes in with a very strong affirmation of faith.
It is really amazing. This particular song has, besides to say the song of the century, but it's been presented at the Oklahoma bombing, 9/11. I remember people were talking about it at Jackie Kennedy's funeral. And one person said, "Oh, the On Eagle's Wings guy." And these were Protestants, and that's what they're known for. So it was kind of really unusual how it impacted a few incidents nationally. Had brought into the Protestant world. The last couple of questions regarding vocations and health. And I guess we're going to go to health first and then end with vocations and one last final question. You had a health scare a few years ago. Can you tell us about the disease and your transition from there?
Yeah. Well, that was 2003. 2004. I pretty much lost that whole year. I came down with a neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is also sometimes called French polio. It's a very rare syndrome. Basically, what it involved, it's an autoimmune thing where all of the sheathing of my peripheral nerves was stripped away. So in a very short period of time, I went from being a fairly active, healthy guy to someone who couldn't breathe on his own, couldn't swallow, couldn't eat. At one point, the only muscles I could control was one eye. I could blink. And that was enough for me to be able to communicate with an alphabet board. People would say, first part of the alphabet or second, and I'd blink, and then they'd start saying letters, and I'd blink at the letter. But that malady and the 3 months in a Mayo Clinic getting my health back, and then another 3 months of outpatient therapy and then another 6 months of just getting better really taught me a lot. So I don't know what more you'd want to know about it, but it was a pretty intense experience.
Wow. Vocations, your initial calling. Thank you for that. Your calling itself, because a lot of people hear the calling, but they're scared to touch it. Because somebody say, I'm not sure I'm called, or I'm called. Tell us about your calling to the priesthood, and what advice do you have for people who's like on the edge? They know they've been called, but they can't listen because they have all this distraction around them.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, I'll say me first. I mean, the earliest I remember not seriously, but even thinking about being a priest was way back in second grade. But that was all just fantasy stuff. It was the same way a second grader might think of being a fireman or whatever. I tested it out, as I mentioned, going into high school and then a college seminary. But I wasn't at all sure at the end of college that this was what I was called to do, which is why I left and did some work. For me, the most important thing was staying faithful to some level of prayer, talking it over with people I trusted, vocation directors and spiritual directors. But then ultimately it was about having people with whom I worked telling me that they thought they could see me doing this. Folks who experienced me as a music director in their parish saying, we trust the way you think, we trust the way you pray, we trust the way you work with people. We can see you doing this. So that's what pushed me back into major seminary. And then from that point on, you're really in a process where the seminary and the diocese, or if you're an order priest, the order, make some decisions along with you about whether or not you're called. So that's kind of my history. The advice I give is get in touch with a vocation director or a spiritual director and learn how to listen. You need a lot of silence for that. You need a lot of prayer for that. But learn how to listen and share it with someone that you trust. Yeah, that's, I think, what I'd say.
Okay. And then if when you break the news to mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and they want their grandchildren, is there a closing statement you can give them? You can say, I am called.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can, but I don't think you have to make it that severe. I mean, you can certainly say you understand why. And frankly, I don't think it's parents so much that are scared for you because they won't have grandchildren. I don't think it's that kind of selfish thing. It's they know how tough the life can be. They don't want to see you lonely. They know that frequently priests can be really stressed by people who have kind of overwhelming expectations of them that they can never meet. And I think parents sometimes just don't want you to go into a life where you will be lonely and you will be overstressed. But then you can talk with them about, there are all sorts of other dedicated folks too, doctors and social workers who can live a life of service. But yeah, the celibacy thing is also a big issue. And that's something you've got to be sure that you're also called to. So,
okay. Last question. 100 years from now, when I was speaking at the very beginning of the interview, how you like to be remembered? And is there a song that really speaks to you to say who you are?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not at all sure that 100 years from now, any of my music is going to be remembered. I'm just too much of a historian to recognize, things come and go. An Isaac Watts hymn, we know a few of those and we sing them regularly, but the guy wrote, hundreds of them. So I'm not sure any of mine are going to last. If I had to pick one out of all the stuff I've written, it's a setting of Psalm 139. You have searched me and you know me. It's probably the one I like the best. It's also pretty sophisticated in some ways, hard to sing. So it's not the Eagle's Wings. Eagle's Wings is going to be more popular, but I'd rather be known for that. But frankly, I'd like to be less known as a musician and more known as a priest who was who was faithful to my calling, was a good college teacher, and tried to help people.
Well said. I really appreciate you doing the interview and coming on the show to talk about your music and your career. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Again, thank you for listening to the Core Business Show. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to take any breaks because of the amount of time we're trying to get it done in 30 minutes. But anyway, everybody, thank you for listening to the Core Business Show. I'm Tim J.K., your host. That was Father Jan Michael Joncas, composer, a liturgist. We're going to play one track of his, and we'll be back with the show.
Thank you for listening to the Core Business Show with Tim J.K. For a free quote on equipment leasing and financing, visit our website, applecapitalgroup.com. That's applecapitalgroup.com. And fill out the information to receive your free quote. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. And remember, you can always get to the Core via iTunes. You'll find all our previous episodes there. Thanks again for listening to the Core Business Show with Tim J.K.